Tim, to Mr. Zierli, and he's got a bunch of people here for us today. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, President Newman. We are here again as a follow-up to the last board workshop to talk about the bond project overview for the elementary district and possibility of two potential bond measures. And I know we're kind of short on time, so I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Domenico with Capital Public Finance Group, our board approved financial advisor for the bond program, and so she can get right into the presentation.
Hi everyone. We wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to really talk through and discuss the conceptual bond. And to prep for that discussion, we put together just some general information about the projects themselves for an elementary bond, to really just kind of focus your attention on these two categories of projects. We're happy to go into more detail or answer questions, but we wanted to kind of keep this workshop somewhat high level, give you the foundational information, and then provide you with an opportunity to ask questions and have a discussion about the concepts before moving forward. And I don't have a clicker, so I don't know if oh, no problem. Sometimes it's magic. So we want to start with just a review. I was last here actually in December, and at that meeting we did a workshop. I don't know if you all remember, there were boxes around the room and we were spending money. Not real money, it was the Monopoly money, but it was still kind of fun to just have an exercise about what are the facilities needs on this district and what is the importance of those projects. That information, and we'll talk about that shortly, that information is incorporated into an overall formula for how the district prioritizes projects. So there is a substantial facilities need that's been identified district-wide, not just at the elementary district. Although we're going to focus in on the elementary district, there is a substantial need district-wide. There was a facilities needs assessment that the district completed, and we talked about that in December. There were also additional projects that were identified by staff from input from various stakeholders and school sites related to new construction and school enhancement projects. Staff went in and analyzed those projects and ranked those projects based on an urgency and the importance of the projects. This is all the stuff we discussed at that December workshop. I don't want you to forget that because that's a lot of the foundational information that we use moving forward. It was really clear at that point that with the district's limited resources, a bond measure was going to be needed in order to fund those vast needs. But when we started talking about dollars and we started comparing it to the bond feasibility and how much money the district could get in a bond and the work that needs to go into it and what we could really manage at one point in time, we kind of narrowed the focus a little bit more. There are limitations on tax rates that you can raise from a bond, and that limits the amount of money that we were able to generate and use on projects. So when we looked at that picture, we had a huge need and limited revenues available. On top of it, when we looked at it from both the elementary and the high school district perspective, we were taking on a lot, not just from a staff perspective, but also from a community perspective. And what's really the community's threshold and tolerance for the district asking for resources to support facilities improvements. So from that point, we recommended kind of narrowing our focus a little bit more on these really high priority needs that were coming specifically out of the elementary district. And at the last workshop, you heard a synopsis of a feasibility analysis that was completed, a survey, which assessed the public opinion towards a bond measure, but specifically at the elementary level, because that was kind of a more manageable concept to tackle. And practically, we didn't think that the community could support layers upon layers upon layers of bonds. We needed to really focus our attention. We are recommending that before pursuing a high school measure at this point, even though there's vast needs, we do some additional research because it's a larger boundary. There's more things happening with regards to existing taxes and community facilities districts taxes that these taxpayers are already paying. And we need to take a little bit more time than 2018 to really tackle the high school projects, which brought us to that feasibility assessment at the elementary level, which really had pretty substantial support. And we weren't just looking at one measure at the elementary district. We were looking at two measures. We were looking at two measures Because of those tax rate limitations, we weren't able to raise enough funding to really tackle even our tier 1 high priority projects. We actually needed the amount of money that we could raise from 2 bond measures to tackle those high priority projects. So what we surveyed and what we're proposing is an elementary district general obligation bond measure broken into 2 different components. One is a health and safety measure. It would fund about $74 million worth of projects locally. Some of those dollars could be matched from state funding, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And we're recommending a second measure of $57 million to fund classroom and science lab enhancement projects. And what we want to do today is give you a better picture of what do those fancy titles mean. I always have to start with the numbers because how do we get to 74? What does that really mean? 74 million from a health and safety measure plus 57 from the classroom enhancement measure combines to be $131 million in general obligation bond funding. You add that to an estimated 85 million in state funding eligibility. That would be state funding eligibility specific to the elementary district for classroom replacements for those buildings that are 25 years old or older, or portable classrooms that are 20 years old or older, that the district has generated substantial eligibility for. And that's based on today's dollars for modernization funding. In total, that gives us about 216 million of project funding. Now, if we think back, what will that fund? That will fund the tier 1 high priority needs for the elementary district, both from the facilities needs analysis and that classroom enhancement and school enhancement project list, and some of the tier 2 projects. I have to take a breath because state funding is always the quagmire here. If state funding just appeared like it was supposed to and we got it as we were spending money on projects, I would tell you it would fund a large portion of the tier 2 projects and all of the tier 1, and we'd be able to move forward in the next, say, 6 to 8 years on completing those projects. But state funding is not keeping pace with the actual demand for funding. The state recently passed a school bond of Proposition 51 of $9 billion. A lot of that money is already spoken for. If you were looking on the new construction side, I would tell you you're probably too late to submit a funding application and actually get funded out of Proposition 51. But on the modernization side, experts from the Coalition of Adequate School Housing are expecting that money will last till probably early 2020. So if we were able to get together a funding application and submit funding, we could actually receive an approval for funding prior to 2020. In order to do that, we need to have plans and specifications approved by the Division of the State Architect, which means we need to have a funding source to fund the design, and we need to identify our local matching fund for the entire project. A general obligation bond would satisfy that requirement. That sounds great. We've got our funding application, we can do everything by 2020. Except the state is delayed in issuing the bonds, so even though we may submit an application in 2020, right now, dollars wouldn't be expected until probably 2027, maybe 2028. So I go back to this comment that seemed like a simple comment, that we could fund our tier 1 projects and most of our tier 2 projects. The reality is a lot of those projects will be funded on a reimbursement basis. So when the state money comes in, we could then use that money for those tier 2 projects. But in 2028, you're not likely to have the same buying power that you do in 2018. So that's a long way of explaining to you why $216 million of projects isn't necessarily going to fund, $16 million of project funding isn't necessarily going to fund $216 million worth of projects in the future. Before I go further and go into the project list, does anybody have a question about how that plays off? Because I think that's an important concept. Oh, yeah.
So if we get the money after we needed the money, then, so how do you have to then have excess money to then pay for it, or you have to have another source to borrow?
Yes,
right?
and yes. And we're not recommending a borrowing plan here. What we're recommending is you cash fund with, if you have a successful bond measure,
Right.
or bond measures, you cash fund your high priority projects, and you actually defer your next level of projects until you receive that state reimbursement from the original projects.
Okay.
Use that to fund the next round, and hopefully we have a new governor that's going to help us a little bit more, and we aren't going to wait another 8 to 10 years before we get the next round of funding on the books. The rumors are right now that the state is considering a 2020 bond, but we don't know that that's going to happen at this point.
Follow up, because Amy got there before I did. So essentially, reimbursement for anything wouldn't be looking out until 27 or 28, based on something we're trying to do in 18.
I wish I could tell you something different, yes.
I'm working the math in my head, because I
Yeah.
think there's that issue and the fact that, in all honesty, the governor didn't want the bond we've got now,
Yes,
and fought high and low and wide to keep it off the ballot,
yes,
and only got it there when he was dragged across the finish line,
yes.
being told, we don't care what you think, we're putting this on the ballot. And so to your point on state funding, it's jinky as anything ever is.
Yes.
Hence nervous. My new middle name.
So we don't, when we're thinking about what we're going to build, what I'm comfortable with is you're going to have bond funding for your tier 1 projects. It's the next layer that we're going to have to wait and receive reimbursement and then use the cash to fund those projects. And again, it won't have the same buying power. Now, we're going to have a new governor in the fall. Does that mean that they're going to keep the same pace of bond issuance? No, but we're not going to be able to catch up from 2027 to immediately issuing bonds in 2020. We may go from 2027 to 2024, but there's still a delay. And I just want to make sure you're clear that we are leveraging state funds, but the state funds are coming in the future. Doesn't mean we still shouldn't apply for the free money.
Because we have to have a GO in order to even get those monies in the future.
Yes, you picked up on that as well. That's another really key point.
Okay.
You need a GO to fund just the design and the scoping of these projects.
Right.
You have a facilities needs assessment. That's a really high level picture.
Right.
It takes substantial resources to actually define the scope of a project and actually design projects. You need a funding source to do that. You can't even get in line for the funding until you have plans and specifications, which is more than just a scope. You need to have plans
And they're approved by the state architect.
approved by the state.
Yeah. The state architects, right?
Yeah.
We're aware of who they are.
Is there one down there? Yeah.
And then everything that you're telling us says there's no reason or logic in delaying this process. We've got to get going.
There's no reason to delay. If you wait your next opportunity for a bond would be 2020. At that point, it's even more unknown.
Yeah.
And your construction costs are going to keep going up. Right now, our construction cost environment, I'm hearing down in Southern California, they're saying 8 to 10 or 12% construction cost escalation every year. Here, I'm seeing more between 4 to 6% escalation every year. But these costs are in 2018 dollars. It's just more expensive in the future, and I don't know that your bonding capacity is going to change that drastically. So there's definitely reason to move forward today, and voter sentiment was positive. Any other? Yeah.
So going back to what you just said, I think one of the concerns I'm going to continue to have is, that we asked this at the last meeting, is we don't have projects in the hopper. And the question that in my mind that I don't have an answer to, and maybe it comes up later in the meeting, is what does it cost us to get an approved project or two in the hopper to quote unquote be shovel ready? Because I've now learned that doesn't mean I've got dirt and a shovel.
No,
That means that there's something that we've got sitting there, and I think the example countywide was the Crosstown Road across Clarabelle. They were able to get that funded because they were ready and an opportunity came up. We're not even there yet. What is that cost to get one or two projects in place? And is it so exorbitant that we couldn't set aside money and say, in our general budget, in our general fund, that we could say, let's get these two things rolling in the hopper so that we're at least moving in that direction, irregardless of what happens in a ballot initiative?
So there's a couple challenges there, and I hear what you're saying, because I think a lot of
At
districts
least I'm making
struggle with
sense,
this.
right?
Yeah, I think districts struggle with this. So what could we invest today while we're on a parallel path over here, just to have something ready to go? I'm gonna answer your question directly, and then I'm gonna talk about another concept that a lot of my clients take on. So what is it gonna take? It depends on the project scope, and I know you want a direct answer. It depends on the scope.
It could be ballparky.
So here's what I've seen is about architect's fees about 8% of the total project amount. That's kind of gets you to that point. That's actually Office of Public School Construction's rough number that they use to get you to that point. So I don't know exactly. So if you wanted to give me a particular project, we could have more detailed conversation. But that's the best number we could get to. If you're going to pursue a bond, though, I have a lot of clients that are in the same situation because, frankly, all your general fund money is going to salaries and benefits and keeping the lights on and program, and your capital sources are going to kind of maintain what you have and keep going. What they do when they're considering bond measures and they don't want to wait for this process before they actually start to deliver is they kind of separate projects and identify what I'm going to call quick strike projects, which are things that don't necessarily have to go to DSA but can touch everybody. So you identify something small at all the school sites, and the easiest example is a marquee. So a new marquee at a school site, they get something immediately while we're doing all this other stuff behind the scenes to scope out projects and get things moving forward. So that's a concept that a lot of districts use when they're using bonds to try to just get things going. Or they do look at their sources and they look at what they're already doing. So if we have large HVAC replacements, let's use that as an example, we may be funding that from our general fund, or we may be funding that from our existing funding sources or deferred maintenance funds. But we can actually, if they're large enough in scope, maybe we can come up with a plan for how some of those are put into larger projects that we can attack immediately from a bond because we're already planning, we're already doing this. So what I would recommend is looking what you're already doing and what you're already planning to do with resources that exist today and what you're going to be spending in the next year, and see if we can create a bond project. Some of those are legitimately a bond project where we can really get going sooner rather than later. So that's just kind of two approaches to that. You follow up?
Okay, because what you've addressed is what is also underneath my larger concern here, is that we don't have a flagship project that'll be bellwethered out of this thing that the community can go, look what we did right here. And it's big, and it's beautiful, and everybody can see and say, this is what we did. And I think the second piece of this goes to, and where I have concerns with the survey data from the beginning, and I've thought about it longer, is that we as a district haven't put skin in the game at this point. We're doing our little projects here, there, fixing this, fixing that, for lack of a better term, putting out fires. But we haven't identified a way to say, this is a bellwether project, this is our flagship, this is what everybody will be able to see when we come out of this, and we as a district put resources into it without coming to you first. We put, because there's an electoral part of this that says we have to go to the ballot in a year where there's nothing educational on the ballot. And there's a whole host of other things that we're going to have to cut through the chatter on. If I'm making sense.
In our first meeting, we did go over what we have spent of our the percentage, and maybe Tim, you recall, Mr. Zerli, do you recall that we went
Roger,
over
you
the
have some projects, don't you?
No, we had the percentage of what we spent of our general fund of the last few years. It was like over 60-some million. We had that in our first thing. I could look it up.
It was in the neighborhood. I mean, depending on which meeting. I mean,
Yeah.
we've identified. Now it's from various resources, various funds, but I think it was in the neighborhood of $20 to $30 million
Yeah.
over the last few years that we have provided.
Out
Now,
of general funds.
now I don't know what project that I can go to the community and say, look at this particular project. This is our flagship.
Burbank.
Maybe Burbank Elementary would be one, but I don't know how that resonates throughout the boundaries. But Burbank, based on what I've seen, would be one that we could say, look, this is what we've done with our money for you, for the students of Burbank. And this summer, we're doing $8 to $9 million just this summer of improvements. So there is some substantial amount of infrastructure that we're either adding or improving, and we can make that available fairly easily.
It's on page 7 and 8 of the identifying and funding the district's facility improvement needs from the December 12th, 2017 meeting.
So if I can just address the basic concept of needing a flagship project in order for the electoral politics component of this to work out, I actually think it's a common misconception that bond measures need to be built around some sort of marquee project. If you look at your own survey results, which frankly are very consistent with what we see in school districts up and down California and all sorts of different communities, voters understand the basic need to complete projects that aren't particularly sexy or flashy, right? The top priorities of your voters are, fixing leaky roofs, addressing very basic safety and security concerns. And it's almost like do those things first, just like I would in my own home, before you get to the big fancy stuff that's gonna, attract the attention of the neighbors, right? So I would be less concerned about, what's the big flashy thing that we need to be able to point at and flash lights at versus, what are the highest priority needs of our district? What are the basics that are needed to provide a quality education and ensure the safety of our students? Because that's where your voters' priorities are at based on what I've seen in our work here.
Roger, you've been working on this for a long time. You've got some projects already identified could you give us some of those?
Absolutely. This summer we're going to be doing Shackelford paving. We're going to do that entire school site. One of my presentations on one of the projects, I talked about how it's condition based, and that's what we do annually as far as roofing, asphalt, any kind of site condition. Sonoma HVAC is a big one we're doing this year. That's a campus-wide project. So we've been spending our $5 million a year that you've generously approved, and it goes toward those things. And we just keep marching forward as we evaluate school sites. We check our work order program. We do site visits. We do walks. We walk with principals, architects, etc. And that's how we've been living life. So
There's nothing like the Downey reconstruction and the Downey pool and that whole wing that you did there.
Absolutely.
You got projects like that identified too?
yeah, we have 2 more pools we need to be doing since you mentioned pools. Yes, that's a short answer is yes.
But it seems like if we're flagshipping right now, we really need to focus on projects at the elementaries.
Yeah.
So,
Right. We're finishing paving at Burbank, obviously finishing the rest of the campus too, but I mentioned Shackelford earlier, so as far as elementaries go, yes, dollars are continually being spent at that level.
Let's talk through some of those projects, and I think let's frame it a little bit more and think through what that looks like. The health and safety bond, we're taking what we talked about in December, and now we're kind of regrouping into the 2 bonds just to frame the parameters here. So the health and safety bond conceptually would include site improvements, kind of this laundry list here, ADA compliance, roofing. Individually, none of them seem that exciting, right? But if you think about this is really rebuilding these facilities to get them up to a standard that is really expected at school sites. And if you walk through some of the schools in the district, they're in significant disrepair. And from a healthy safety perspective, these improvements really enhance the learning environment for the students. So we want to think through health and safety. How do we get these sites up to a standard that we would expect from a health and safety perspective? Also considering things like parking and drop-off. I know that's a huge issue here, especially in a couple of the sites which are on quite busy intersections, and you've got little ones going into these major streets and major crossings. Even things like the cafeterias. I have to pick on the Wilson cafeteria because I feel like that's just a conversation we keep having. Old building, what is that doing for healthy eating standards? So those are the types of projects that are included in the health and safety bond. Additionally, shade structures. Again, thinking from those hot days that seem to last into November at this point and start, I don't know, any day now. We've got little kids outside and we can create shade areas for them on the exteriors of the building. Yeah.
That was so important to the public that the parents at Rose Avenue funded their own shade structure. You guys know that.
Yeah.
They were adamant on that, and our staff was great in working with them. Did they fund the entire thing other than maybe some installation parts? No. But a lot of it.
They funded about half of it.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's huge. They raised that money with their PTA dollars. So the public already sees the importance of that, and we could point that out in our campaign. I just wanted to make sure you guys were aware.
They had a big problem there at Muir too, where we heard a lot of people about.
No, that was
trees.
Fremont.
Yeah.
And that was an open plan.
Yeah, Fremont.
That was Fremont, yeah. Yeah.
This list was done back in December, and so we've had
additional concerns about safety since February. And so do we have anything on fencing or cameras or anything to do with that?
So, and let's translate that. Let's keep going. So, yeah, so the health and safety bond is also going to be considered your security bond. And the reason I clicked to the next slide is this is actually, we took that language from everything you saw back in December and looked at the survey, looked at kind of what's going on in today's environment. One of the things we actually talked about in that December meeting was accessibility of the sites. And I don't mean ADA accessibility, I mean access into the school sites. So the ballot language has been crafted to be a little bit more generous when it comes to security. And Charles, do you want to speak to the kind of the ballot language and how that came about? And then this is just some proposed ballot language that would be included in that measure.
Sure. So, working with Janet, with your bond counsel, we've taken the initial language that was tested in the survey, and first understanding that it tested quite positively, right? We didn't want to try to fix something that wasn't broke, but at the same time, we tried to take some of what we learned from the survey to enhance some of the key concepts and make the most of the language that we're proposing here. I mean, the challenge that you have with a bond measure is that you have this long list of projects and a multitude of needs, and statute gives us 75 words to try to describe all that, right? So it's a difficult exercise, and realistically, all you can do is provide a very high-level summary, but then behind that, the voters have access to the full project list that's in their ballot pamphlet, as well as all the details that the school district can provide around how funds would be utilized. So just reading through there, the title at the top, which is underlined, is meant to, because we're looking at having two measures on the ballot, not just one, at a glance show the voter, what's the intent of this measure and how is it different from the second measure, which we'll be looking at here in a minute.
And I'm going to jump ahead because I want to touch on what you're saying. And I am going to jump a couple slides here and go to creating the bond project list. So we start with, for each measure, we start with that 75-word statement. And then we look at all of the things that we may do. So I went ahead to page 10, slide number 10. We take the information that was in the needs assessment. We take the information, the projects identified by staff. We take the additional input that the board provided, and we create more extensive project lists that Charles is alluding to. And I'm going to let Janet speak through how that comes together and what that means for a bond, because where you're going to see some of the detail and some of the projects that we want to allow expenditures for would be in this project list. Before I do that, though, it brings up a key point. We had a needs assessment. We had facilities projects identified. Something happened. It created additional facilities needs. This is going to happen over the next few years when the bonds are outstanding. So one of the things Janet's going to touch on is we have this language that identifies exactly what we're going to spend the money on, but it does allow some of that flexibility to expand.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So what you heard a little bit about and had a chance to look at is what we referred to as the ballot label or the 75-word measure, and that's that high-level summary statement that a voter will see when they actually cast their yes or no vote. And some voters will only ever see that. But the full measure, what we call the full ballot text, is really in the ballot pamphlet. It's the complete statement of all of the detail around your measure. So if you read your ballot pamphlet for any measures that you vote on, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's where all the detail is, and sometimes you get through it and sometimes you don't. But the idea here is that when you call this measure or these measures, you will do it by resolution, and you will have all of the detail. At the time that you act, you will have not only your 75-word statement, but you will have the full ballot text. And the centerpiece of that full ballot text is your bond project list. And so if you recall or have been through this before, Prop 39 was the voter initiative that we passed in California in 2000 that changed the voting threshold from 2/3 to 55%. And in exchange for that lower voting threshold, you had to agree to certain accountability features for in exchange for having the lower voter threshold. And one of those key cornerstone features was this bond project list, a list of the specific projects that you would be using the money for. Since that time, we've had about 18 years now to try to live under Prop 39 and figure out what it means. There has been only really one case well, actually two cases that talk a little bit about what a specific bond project list is. And we do know a couple things. We know it doesn't have to be site specific, although we know that sometimes districts and voters would like to know the detail on a site by site basis, but you can do it on a category basis. So, for example, if one of your categories could be something about safety and security, and you could have underneath that category a list of the more detailed sort of assumptions and needs that you have. But whether you choose to do it on a site-by-site list versus a category-driven list, or a combination of both, because there's ways of blending, is something that you will have to decide, and that we will probably, upon further discussion among our kind of small group here that are trying to put this these ideas together for you, will maybe reach some consensus regarding. So you have some options there. The idea, though, is that ultimately, if your bonds pass, you will have a bond oversight committee or two, depending on what we would decide to do there. And your bond oversight committee has to have enough specificity to know whether you're actually doing the things that you have promised the voters to do. So there's some play in there about how specific is specific enough. How do we preserve options and flexibility for you over what could be 10 years worth of construction? As needs change, school sites, a school site could close. What do we do if we had a whole list of projects at a school and then that school is closed, or something happens that might change your what your needs might be over that long period of time? So as we get more into, how do we take this very large amount of need and start sort of winnowing it down into something meaningful, manageable, that also will resonate and actually cover what you might need, that's kind of the big part of this project that I think we'll have to work through.
So what we want to make sure you have is a picture of how we take what we talked about in December, take the survey, what we talked about at the last meeting, and then how the interplays with what your plans may be over the next few years, and how that all works out as far as ballot language and that project list. But I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that there may be projects here that the board we don't know exactly what that project looks like yet, because we don't have the dollars to spend on the design and the scoping. And it's how do you make sure you have a defined list with still maintaining that flexibility for how we do what we need to do moving forward, and we're actually spending the money on these high priority needs. And your district has a lot of data. And it's something, Roger, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit on just some of the health and safety needs, but you have got a lot of information, and you've gathered input from stakeholders about what these high priority needs are and what's kind of on the list. Do you want to say a couple words just about what that
Sure.
looks like?
Yeah, just daily life in my job, either getting calls, emails, requests from site administrators, hearing from folks from the back of the building, maintenance staff, sharing deteriorating conditions. Security requests right now are coming in, as you would imagine. Space issues, which we're addressing at Kirschen, Roosevelt, and Downey, those continue to come in. We collect this data because we know that there's this much need and this much money at this point in time. So we try to be as strategic as possible on how we're going to address these things, knowing and hoping at some point down the road we'll have bigger capital dollars to address all the needs, or at least a lot more of the needs. So just in the normal course of work, I have collected a lot of data, needs lists, site assessments, parking drop-off issues, busing issues, fencing, secured front offices, HVAC, fire alarm systems at school sites. We're knocking out one this fiscal year. We're going to knock out another elementary next year with our operating money. Can't do two in one fiscal year. That's how expensive they are. So this is an ongoing process. So I look at this process in this room as something that could hopefully bear a lot of fruit, or at least an option to bear a lot of fruit down the road with addressing things long term and on a much grander scope.
Mr. Orth, when you look at this proposed ballot statement, the first statement is repair leaking roofs. We have our roofs on a repair cycle, right? And so it rained last week. Do we have a significant amount of leaking roofs in our elementary schools?
Yes, we have roofs that are due for replacement that leak. We have a lot of roof leaks. That's the short answer. And we are addressing our roofs that are outside their warranty right now. It's called a GeoFlex. It's an older single ply membrane. Those are way out of warranty. We're knocking those out right now. And then we're moving on to the Firestones that are roughly 20 plus years and moving forward that way. So, yeah, we have roofs. We're putting them in with the highest warranty we can get. With our current spec is Firestone. And that is, we have a systematic approach to that. Again, condition-based, based upon work orders, and we do factor in warranty on everything we do.
The other bond measure is really focusing on those classroom enhancement projects. The big one being the portable replacement projects. And I know your boards had workshops, I think, just on portable replacement alone, and just the vast need for that, as well as upgrades to the school and improvements on the interior, so interior finishes, thinking of cabinets and floors and ceilings, and looking exterior envelope improvements, your doors, your siding, your roofing, your HVAC, all of that kind of stuff really would fit into this classroom enhancement project. Again, improving the learning environment. There is some overlap, and that's what's interesting and something that's going to be a challenge just moving forward. These bond measures work in concert with each other. There may be project scopes by the time we actually scope out some of these projects where the funding is actually going to come from each measure, because we don't want to just go in and just do one thing that's identified in this bond measure, because it's not as efficient as going in and doing the whole package. That's going to be something at the staff level that we have to work with your staff on how do we know what portion of the project can be funded from this source versus this source. But so there is some overlap. I don't want you to think they're completely independent. They're intended to work together. They're intended to work in concert with one another, and there may be some overlap on those projects. The proposed ballot statement for the classroom and science lab enhancement measure was drafted with the similar concept. And Charles, do you want to just talk briefly about some of the key words in this ballot statement?
Sure, and again, this follows pretty closely with what we tested in the survey, but again, enhancing on some of the concepts. Again, we have the title just to orient the voter to the overarching purpose of this specific measure, which is the classroom and science lab enhancement measure. Janet cautioned us against focusing too specifically on academic improvements, which could be construed as non-capital improvements, which obviously you can't fund with a bond measure. So that's why we oriented it to the classroom and science lab piece, so it still has an academic context without using those specific terms. And then we're talking about updating classroom science labs to support quality instruction, right? So now we're putting in that academic context as opposed to the health and safety context, replacing aging portables with permanent classrooms, and equipping classrooms with technology with the purpose of preparing students for 21st century jobs. So I think that gets at sort of keeping our classrooms and our schools contemporary. And then similar language related to accountability and oversight that we saw in the first measure.
So, of course, one of the big questions is we have all these needs we've identified. How do we get a handle on what we do first? And Roger touched on it a little bit. You already have a lot of data. The district already has a formulaic approach to determining how to do projects and which ones to move forward. The big challenge is you don't have the funding source in place at this point in order to define that scope and better define what those projects are. And go back to the Wilson cafeteria. Are you just going to go in and replace a cafeteria? Are you going to look at that site and figure out the best way to enhance the site given the parameters and given the high priorities on that campus? And that's really what you would do. You would, if your bond was successful, you would understand how much of your budget could be allocated to that school site. You would get an architect on board, walk through, we need to replace this cafeteria. We have portable classrooms that need to be addressed. We have other improvements that need to be handled at this campus. What's the best way to handle these high priority needs on this campus, and what's the most efficient way to do that given our bond funds? That formulaic approach takes into consideration, and I have these scribble notes from when the board spent its money. We actually take into consideration the board priorities for the various projects. That's an input to the formula. What you can envision is, as the funds are available, staff runs it through their metric and says, okay, boards thinks this is a high priority need. School site staff is screaming at us that we need to do this. We have a funding source available. Staff thinks this is a high priority need. Look how we ranked it. It's one of our tier 1 projects. That that concept will come to the top, and then with design professionals, they'll work out an overall project scope that'll of course come back to the board for review and discussion. So this is how the projects would be implemented if the bond measure was successful. But I don't want to lose sight of that concept we were talking about to begin with. How do we give the community return earlier? And I think you want to instill, and we've talked to staff about that, some quick strike projects, something we can do right off the bat while we're waiting for the Vision Estate architect to go through their process, and while we're waiting for, you know, the construction process that could take a really long time. We need to be able to demonstrate that we're working pretty quickly. So those are the things that, with your direction, that would be the bond program that the staff would develop. We've already talked about the bond project list, so I'm going to skip that unless there's questions on how that gets translated again. But I do want you to have the understanding of what happens next. So we're sitting here in April. If you want to move forward with a November election, we would need the board to take action in June in order to officially call for an election. At what is that? The legal deadline's August, but the county needs some additional time in order to put the materials together. From June to November, you're essentially, the campaign would start. That's really when you're advocating for the measure outside of spending public resources on the measure. So you're not doing nothing. The community is out there, your supporters are out there advocating for a measure. There are messages, those are things that Charles would work with the campaign committee on, but leading up to that, there are some technical steps that need to happen. We as staff need to really finalize the ballot statements, the project list, the bond amount. That information needs to be solidified before the board has a resolution in front of you that has all that information included. At the May meeting, at your May meeting, we were proposing to actually take a draft document to you with a resolution that includes, well, it's the resolution that you would be approving, and I can let Janet talk in more detail, but it would include a bond authorization amount for each measure. It would include the actual ballot language, it would include the project list, among other things, so that you have a chance to see what the board would then need to take action on in June if you decided to move forward. And again, before we get to that point, we need your feedback on if there's other parameters that need to be included in those materials so that you're seeing a document that makes sense to you. Do you want to speak about any of the? Okay. Charles, I know there's education and outreach piece that's an important.
Sure. So the in order to meet the deadline to qualify for the ballot, we're looking at bringing the final bond resolutions to you at your June 25th meeting. We have basically backwards mapped from that a timeline that goes month by month and week by week between now and then for an informational outreach strategy. So as Kathy mentioned, you know, the district cannot advocate for the passage of the bond, but you can provide impartial information about the needs that are, you know, leading you to look at a bond measure and the types of projects and educational improvements that would occur if the voters pass the bond. So what we're looking at doing is, you know, based on the information that we're developing with staff on here are the priority projects that would likely be addressed with a bond, or at least the decisions that the board is considering, to develop fact sheets, talking points, answers to frequently asked questions, and presentations that can be made at individual school sites and distributed by school administration and staff at their sites to help the parent community and teachers and employees at those sites understand what is being proposed here and give them an opportunity for input as leading up to your decision. Outside of the school community, we also have a plan for utilizing direct mail, social media, online information to also get the information out to the non-parent communities. So a series of a couple of direct mail pieces that would go out to the public prior to the board's June decision point to say, you know, here are the facility needs we've identified. It's been almost 20 years since we've made a major investment in our schools of this nature. Here's what we're proposing to do, and offering again an opportunity for the public to provide input on the process before you have to make a final decision. Red light, green light, are we moving ahead with a bond measure? And again, none of this can be advocacy. It has to be impartial information, and we'll work closely with Janet. We've done this on many bond proposals in the past to walk that line appropriately between providing the information to the voters that they need to make an informed decision without crossing the line into advocacy and trying to influence their decision. So we've got a plan that we've shared with the administration and staff that will guide those activities between now and June 25th. There is a final step just after that June 25th board vote that if you do decide to place the measure on the ballot, basically announces that decision to the public, says, you know, hey, here's 2 education proposals that you'll see on your ballot this November. Here's where you can find more information. But it's strictly informational, non-advocacy, but it's a nice handoff to the campaign piece that will come subsequently.
Tim, do you have anything you want to add on next steps?
Not right now. I will.
So with that, we want to make sure you have an opportunity for input, discussion, and just your thoughts.
So you're saying that the district cannot advocate, we as individuals, what limited is that to us?
Since we have a lawyer in the room, I will defer.
Well, you don't shed your First Amendment rights.
Right.
For the election, really, when it comes to board members, what that translates to is no use of district funds, services, supplies, or equipment. How you use your time is up to you. There's no prohibition on that. We do normally encourage that you identify yourself by title only for purposes of identification and not because as an individual board member you're speaking for the board, for example. So there's some things like that that we would recommend to you. But really that anti-advocacy statute is literally no district funds, services, supplies, or equipment may be used to advocate for or against a ballot measure. So once there is a ballot measure, then that prohibition comes to be. And we do a lot of work often around just the education of the entire kind of all the staff, everyone, to make sure that that's clear. And we usually encourage you as you are like in the throes of that period of time, if you are contemplating an activity and you're not clear whether it's okay or not, you're free to pick up a phone and ask me to let you know whether I think it will pass muster or not.
I think Trustee Brown has a question.
So it seems like we really need to generate some huge public support from some key people to make sure that this all happens. Somebody's got to raise money. The school district can't. We've got to be able to pay for signs. We've got to be able to pay for these mailers that you're talking about. We've got to be able to get information out in the hands of the voters. We've got to generate the strength of people of influence so that there are folks in the community speaking on our behalf, not always against us. So how and when do we organize? I thought from the last meeting we kind of identified this as a day to get started with that community effort. So where do we go and how do we get that started?
So our meeting tonight is focused on the district's role in the process, right? Developing the measures, moving them forward, the next steps to flesh out that project list and whatnot. And then what I'm talking about is the district's informational communication effort, which, as Janet describes, as long as it stops short of advocacy, it's appropriate for the district to do some education and information to the public. Now, you're absolutely right that there is an advocacy part of the process. It's just that we can't have those conversations in district facilities and steer clear of the prohibition on using public resources for advocacy. So those conversations need to occur outside of official boardrooms, outside of official board meetings, but there's no reason why a group of citizens that includes board members, could include staff working on their own time, not in their official capacity as a district employee, can have conversations about how a group would come together to raise private resources, to purchase signs, to do mailings, to recruit endorsements, to do all the things that campaigns do in order to be successful. That can happen on a parallel track. It just can't happen as part of the same process that the district is undertaking.
So if I understand that correctly, we really can't discuss that part of it in this kind of a meeting.
That's right.
Individuals need to come forward and organize someplace else.
Yes. Is that what you would advise, Janet?
I would say that it is perfectly fine for you sitting as a board trying to learn about what this process will be and what the legal requirements are, that we can sort of have a conversation about, yes, it's absolutely true that for the measure to be successful, you need to make sure you have the resources even just the people resources who are going to help get this off the ground. The specific ways you might do that and all of that needs to be really done through an independently funded campaign committee that will happen outside of a forum like this. But just as far as kind of everybody getting up to speed on what the effort will take, it certainly is true that I think you should have a shared understanding of what that need is going to be.
Okay, so will that committee receive any guidance from professionals to make sure that they're doing what is appropriate to advocate for the bond?
Yes, I'm available to advise them. I mean, that's part
And
of
who pays for your services when it's an outside committee?
ultimately that committee. But there has to be a firewall between what the district is paying for and what the committee is paying for.
So can you give us a recommendation? Do we need to try to organize in such a way that we can identify some individuals at the staff level that are willing to participate and members that are willing from the board to participate so that we can get a grassroots organization going?
I think it's smart at this point to start thinking about that and identifying the people that would be part of that process. I think more urgently, timeline wise, the focus should be on finalizing a project list so that we're making progress on developing the measures that will need to come before you in June to be approved. We have until November to ultimately implement a campaign strategy, so there's a little less time sensitivity on that front. And there's also work that the district needs to do its informational outreach between now and when the board calls for the election. I think that would also be a more time-sensitive area of focus. But again, on a parallel track to that, start identifying who those leaders are. They may be in the room now, they may not. There may be other community leaders that we would want to get together on a parallel track to discuss an advocacy campaign strategy, raising money, recruiting volunteers, pulling together the resources to carry the process forward once the district has to step back at the end of June, right? So as long as those conversations are occurring in a less formal setting than this, to identify who those people are and organizing some conversations, then I think that's what needs to be happening at this point. And I'm happy to have conversations offline where we can talk about that separate and apart from what the district is doing to plan for a bond election.
So just to protect the rest of the board, how do we have those conversations outside of the Brown Act? And we probably need some legal direction on that. I'm guessing that 3 or more of us can't discuss this matter.
I have some guidance for you on that subject. You can be, I would not recommend that more than a majority of you, a quorum, are running a campaign, because I think that becomes the problem, because it's arguably district business and thus a meeting outside of an agendized meeting. But that does not mean that all of you couldn't be participating in the various activities of a campaign, even if you were all in the same room together, as long as you're not gathering together to discuss district business. So I think there are some ways to structure that, and it's perfectly okay, but I would not have a quorum of you being like a steering committee of a campaign, because I think that is going to get you into some trouble.
Could we, as a board, when we're like here in this setting, talk right now about having one of us like just be, to start the public contact and start getting a committee together? Because frankly, when I look at this timeline and I know what it takes to raise money and I've run 2 campaigns, so I mean, what a mailer costs, I can tell you that right now. Before I'm going to vote to put this on the ballot in June, I'm going to want to know that we've got some bodies on this that want to do this and are like, woohoo, and they're ready to go. I don't know where the rest of you are at on that. So my first question is, can we have a discussion now that, like, Chad, you've been like, gunning for this since you got on the board, and I appreciate your energy on this, and we appreciate that. So if we wanted to say as a board, hey, we think Chad ought to go out and find some people for this, could we say that as a board or no?
Well, since we don't actually have a ballot measure on, there's anything is only potential right now.
Okay.
So I think you could do some very high level, delegation for individual board members, you know, to be tasked with doing some community outreach, for example. And I
Okay.
think that would be fine. Once you are moving into putting together some resolutions and moving to to actually calling the bond measure, we'll start really not discussing anything about campaigns or advocacy,
At a
not
board
in
meeting.
this setting at all.
Yeah, okay. So once there's, so after we hit that June 25th date, we don't have anything agendized, can't talk about this at a board meeting. That-
Someone could come in and make public comment to you.
Sure,
You
that's
could
not
briefly
agendized.
respond.
We get that.
Exactly, but you would not have agendized discussion. You actually are able to adopt a resolution in favor of the measure. There's a case about that.
Sure.
In the context of that is like de minimis in terms of the use of the boardroom, the lights in the room, et cetera, that you can take that position. Obviously, you wouldn't be calling for the ballot measures if you were not supporting them. So that may be of limited usefulness, but in general, no, you will not discuss the bond as an issue at a board meeting.
I know
You good?
Agenda item coming up, so I just want to do a little time check real fast.
You don't have anything up? We don't have anything else?
Well, it's another presentation on this agenda item, so it's yeah, we have another,
Okay.
okay.
but that's okay. This is your meeting, so, I mean, if there's,
Are you finished, Dave? Because I want to,
Well, I want to, can we have a little discussion about what I just threw out there?
I want to come behind you
Yeah.
because I'm waiting for you to talk and I'm
Yeah,
waiting to listen to Chad and
Yeah, first of all, Chad, I threw you out there. What do you think?
I've already thrown myself under this bus.
Yeah. There's,
So I'm ready to take it on.
okay,
So, but I don't want to do it alone.
yeah.
I think the concern I have, and it goes back to the timeline you're talking about, is that June is 60 days away.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if those of us in the room that don't live here aren't aware, there's elections going on right now. And people are fundraising their rear ends off from sheriff to district attorney to county supervisor of education to two supervisor assistants to judges. They are working this community right now. And I've got a general feeling that going back to people for money to fund this is going to be tricky. And doing it at the speed of light is going to make it tricky on a curve. And doing it without any of us out there walking campaign districts and running for election just took the curvy road and put it uphill. And doing all this in a quick minute, and we are talking about a quick minute.
Yeah.
Because we're talking 60 days to 180 days to 200 to a ballot initiative with a community that's been fundraised already, districts that have been walked, they've been mailered, and then we're going to get ready to get mailered every 2 weeks going into June. We're going to get mailered every 3 weeks going into November with a governor's race. And if we're not going to acknowledge those constraints while we say hands off, I think it's tricky. I think that puts a lot of trust in a lot of folks. And when I look over here, I don't see any of the community members saying, go do this. I see the same folks that I would expect to see. But you don't see businessmen and folks saying, yeah, I'll go get this committee started. I'm going to go prop this thing up and go run with it. It's us, and it's the same us. And I think that requires more time to put together than 60 to 90 days. And if I'm going to sit in front of a thing, say pass a resolution to put something on a ballot measure, and for all of us to get behind this, there's an awful lot that has to happen in 60 days while we're still doing other things.
Right.
I mean, we're in a superintendent hunt. We've got testing coming up. We've got academic issues, and we've got a survey that I think is probably more insightful than any piece of document that I've seen come across the board in the 3 years I've been here with the community and the stakeholders groups that got involved with that superintendent search. Those guidelines have to be factored into what decisions we make. And that list didn't get to the bond until they got to the bottom. I think there's a lot of concerns in the community about things we're doing. I think we're moving too quick. I think we need to do this. But to me, it seems like a 20 issue, not an 18 issue. And when this first came up and we discussed this, we talked about 20 because there'll be board members running for election. You'll have people walking districts. You'll have people walking precincts. You'll have people knocking on doors related to Modesto City School District. You know what I mean? Is any of this sort of, or am I just on an island?
We're on an island.
No, let's anybody else want to weigh in, and I'd kind of like to open it up to the public. If anybody out there, do you have any?
Well,
You guys
I don't,
Weigh in.
I don't think we're gonna be able to pass it if we don't have the cooperation of the teachers and the employees. So look over there for some of your leadership. You got 3 guys right there, and I've already mentioned Chris, so we aren't gonna do it without them, so look for them for some of this help and leadership.
All right, is there anyone else on the board who want to talk? Raise your hand.
So
Yeah, thank you.
when we when you did Measure L, was that just this last November?
November of
They were
2016,
fundraising
the
for 2 years.
Oh,
transportation measure.
2016. So it was a, okay, so I was trying to remember if it was an even or odd year. I was thinking it was an even year. And so because, anyway, I just remember that really well because a lot of people called me about it. And so and I know that group because they did not have, that was a much harder lift to me than children and schools because it was roads and we'd already lost 2 measures. And that was
It's a 2/3
successful.
vote.
Right, and so yeah, and it was 2/3 vote. So I believe that this seems like it would resonate with the community more than roads did at that moment. And the people that it was a lot of volunteer people that came on board with that. And I don't know what the time frame was when they started their campaign. You probably do.
Summer.
It was summer. Okay, so it
yeah.
was the same.
And I mean, there were processes like this going on ahead of time to do the research, develop the measure, but the campaigning started over the summer. And just to step back for a moment to our timeline here, you have until June 25th to make a decision as to whether or not this is a go or a no-go.
Okay.
And I don't think that tonight we're going to solve whether or not there's a campaign ready to take place, because obviously there isn't. But I think as long as those conversations start occurring now, and you can kind of test the waters as to is there leadership ready to step forward to make this happen, what I saw in the voter research is that the support is there in the community. So if we can marry that with some motivated people willing to spearhead a campaign and get that process going within the next couple of months, I think you're on a good timeline. And I would caution against the comparisons to candidate campaigns, because the process for fundraising and volunteer recruitment looks very different for a ballot measure, because you're tapping into people that care about the schools, not about political issues, right? And there's a whole different available pot of resources available to you there.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I appreciate your reminding us of what happened in 2016. Just because after hearing the report last time at the meeting about the support that the community has for funding this bond right now, gives me hope that now is a good time. And I mean, I know John doesn't want to do it, doesn't believe that, but I'm an optimist. So I really believe that it is possible, and I believe we have the resources in our community, and especially with our union's support and the benefit that they'll receive in their classrooms from it. I think it's a win-win all around. I grant it, finding the right leaders to help us, I think is going to be key, and I appreciate Chad volunteering to help spearhead some of this. So
That's how you do it in the Army.
yeah, that's right. That's right. There we go. So I think as we work through this, I think it will be incumbent upon us to take responsibility in generating some energy around this and seeing what we can do between now and June. And I think that is key. So I'm hoping that as we go about that, we talk to the right leaders and get them on board with us. So I think it's doable. I really do, and I appreciate that we have till June 25th to make the final decision, and we're not doing it tonight. But at least we can find out what the support is out there between now and then.
Would anyone else on the board like to weigh in on this? Chad? Yes.
Well, just going back in history, I don't remember exactly how many years ago it was, but I was sitting on the Sylvan board, and we took on Measure A with a lot of intrepidation. There was fear from several of the board members about the timing. I took that as a personal project and pushed like crazy, found the support within the district and within the community, and we raised the money necessary. We got the work done. I think it's doable, and I think it's necessary, and I think that we can not wait. We've heard what happens when we wait. Things just get more expensive, and we get less done with whatever money we can raise. So it's imperative that we get going. I've got to find people who have the same commitment and energy that I do to make sure it happens. And I'm going to get busy, if I have the board support to do so, to make that happen. So yes, you guys have suggested that I do it, but I am willing. It's not
we
not
haven't
something
really,
I'm not gonna take on.
we don't have anything agendized to do that, so I don't think necessarily the action, but I would say I'm behind you. So, and I see you have some other support behind you here, so I think you've got some walking papers on that. But is there anyone in the public that would like to weigh in on timing and just the timing issue is what I'm really looking for. If there's anyone that wants to weigh in on that at this point.
You will obviously have the support of our members of our association. We are able to turn out significant numbers of walkers.
Yeah, true.
And Chad, I do happen to know a former associate superintendent who recently retired, who mentioned to me prior to her retirement that she would be very interested in working on a bond measure.
Oh, good. That's awesome. That would be very good. Mr. Peterson had some concerns at one point on the timing. What do you think? I'm like I feel like one of your kids in your class, aren't I?
The homework this evening, class. No, I guess my initial reaction prior to the last meeting was oftentimes we try to match the cycle in reference to even and with presidential because turnout is so much higher. But after the last presentation when we met last month and the data that you folks shared with us, you flipped my opinion. It seems to me the timing is now to strike with the favorability, Prop 39 of the 55% threshold. And then when you couple that by the delays potentially at the state delivering the cash, the opportunity costs that we could be leaving on the table. I understand the Tappy the same folks. Doug expressed we have a lot of members in our own membership that are active in the congressional campaigning right now. We recognize those concerns, but the upside of getting this accomplished now, it's been almost 2 decades since the board has pursued this type of funding. It's time to step up to the plate.
All right, thank you. Anyone else on the timing issue? I just wanted to kind of get a weigh in on that. Yes.
So, back in 2014.
And you identify yourself. I remember you from Johnson Controls, right?
I'm Mike Kozlowski from Johnson Controls,
Okay.
speaking independently, not representing Johnson Controls
Okay.
at the moment. In 2014, I was the chair for a bond committee for my home school district in Folsom. And all of the exact same concerns about fundraising and timing and finding volunteers, we had all of those exact same things. And you need a core group for a campaign of about 10 or 12 people to split the work so it's not oppressive on Mr. Brown. But beyond that, there will be plenty of volunteers available to do all the grunt work that's necessary. And the funding that you are tapping into in terms of campaign resources is actually out there for sure for you. The other thing, I'm sure that Charles brought this up because they worked on our Folsom campaign also. That the lower voter turnout's the easier lift. You don't want to wait till 2020 for a challenging bond when the presidential election's going on.
Thank you. All right. Let's go back to the board. Or do you want to? Good evening.
Good evening. I would definitely say that I am going to take this back to my executive committee and to the branch and ask them to be in support of this. This is something that is definitely overdue and well needed for our children. And as I said to the people who were sitting here, that it costs $9,000 a year to educate a student, and it costs $70,000 a year to care for an incarceration. It's better for us to be proactive than to be reactive, and that is the approach I am taking with this whole matter, is that we need to get that message out to the community that we need to support our children and we need to be proactive and we need to do early intervention, not late intervention. It's too late.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. All right. Anyone else? All right. We'll bring it back to the board. I think we have the next agenda item. On the is that we're ready to move on, guys? Then let's move on to the next.
It's the same agenda item. It's just a different
presentation.
topic,
Yeah.
a different presentation. Charles did a great job of talking about the differences between the district's responsibility in informational outreach and a campaign committee's responsibility in informational outreach. And so now we want to turn it over to OpenGov to give a presentation on a potential solution for fact sheets, talking points, helping the community make informed decisions by having a one place where they can go with all this information. And this actually started when Pam was here. This was prior to any discussion of a bond campaign. Pam saw this website. It was for San Juan Capistrano Unified School District, and it was just a way for the district to be open and transparent with their constituents, mainly regarding financial situations. It was a place where they could go see real-time budgeting reports, financial reports, enrollment reports, and so we started talking with OpenGov probably in the fall about a solution for Modesto City Schools and becoming more transparent. And then it kind of changed a little bit, obviously, in the last couple months after December, with the direction of how can we easily provide our community, our constituents, with a one spot for all these talking points that we want for a potential bond measure. So I want to turn it over to Paul Felton with OpenGov, so he can show you what it could look like for our district.
Good afternoon. Sorry, it's hard to face you and talking to this thing at the same time. So there we go. Well, so thank you. I'm a little nervous, but just to give you a little bit of background, OpenGov is a technology company. We're based in the Silicon Valley, and we are focused purely on the public sector. And just a little bit of background, I was a California bond trader actually for 12 years, and learned a lot about public finance and why schools and governments raise funds to pay for projects such as these. But then I decided to quit my job and become a teacher. So actually taught high school in San Francisco for 4 years before finding OpenGov. We were a very mission-driven company, here to literally help the public sector be more transparent and communicative and involve the community in decisions like these. So really quickly, and I wanted to introduce Monica Bandy. I apologize.
Hi everybody, my name's Monica Bandy. I actually started my career as a early childhood education teacher. So it is really awesome to have the opportunity to be here with you today. I work for OpenGov. I'm a solutions engineer there, which means I work with our customers, helping them see kind of the ins and outs of our solution. I can answer any technical questions you have. I also used to actually implement OpenGov. I worked with some of our school district partners in California as well, so I can talk to that. But thanks for having us.
Yeah, I think what's most interesting today is just to hear that we could be potentially a solution to a lot of the problems, not necessarily a problem, but with getting outreach about a potential bond and communicating effectively with all your stakeholders and being proactive versus being reactive, and being a tool for some of this informational outreach. And given that you have a lot of data, we've already actually built a proof of concept with Modesto's financial data so far. But I think the great thing is that we can take, financial data, bond data, non-financial data, and all have it in one place to help you guys better tell your story and then also get feedback from your citizens. So really just wanted to focus here is what we do. We have 3 core tenets here, and one of them is budget and planning. We don't need that right now. Operational performance, internal, operational, looking at data internally, sharing it internally, not necessarily a priority right now, but where we are a priority for the district is citizen engagement. And as Tim mentioned, we have been working with you guys for quite a while. And what I did want to share with you is a couple success stories or a couple cases that we've worked with a handful of school districts so far to communicate and being reactive, not necessarily with a particular bond measure, but with parcel tax initiatives in the Bay Area with Menlo Park School District and San Mateo Foster City School District. And also with Capistrano Unified, they failed an $800 million bond just over a year ago. And I've got a lot of screens open here, I apologize. But I did notice that you mentioned Measure L as a way for, community outreach and getting feedback. But this is just an example of San Mateo Foster City. Some of the reports they have, these are internal. The ability to share revenues and expenditures. This is something we were working with Modesto City Schools already to be more transparent and communicative around the district's data. But then how can we better help the district tell their story? And so one of the examples with San Mateo Foster City School District, we're working with them right now, is how they are how they're using Measure X funds and communicating directly and telling their story. This is called OpenGov Stories. So similar to the expenditure plan for Measure L, how to basically publish this and make this available to your school district community. Let me just back up. But you can basically see that you control the narrative. The data is all residing in the cloud, and we are a cloud-based software. It's all interactive. You can use video, you can use survey results, you can use the data that we already have. But I think the most important thing in here is communicating and getting feedback, providing project updates. So this is assuming maybe this passes already, giving your constituents updates on projects, but then also allowing them to provide their own feedback as well. So if I click on this topic here, it takes us to another, a project, being able to provide your feedback on spending on Measure X. So this is not a one size fits all. So we would work with the district to determine, what are the priorities, engaging with the public to get their feedback on topics, not just about the bonds, but about, student performance, about changing school calendar time. So we're not just here to be a solution for this bond measure, but as a communication tool in general for the district as a whole.
So the key point is it's great to have a lot of data. Data is really important, but it's also key that you're able to distill that data into easily digestible facts so that anyone can understand what they need to know in order to make an informed decision when it comes to something like a bond. So you're able to kind of cherry pick the pieces of data that you want to put a narrative next to so that you're able to really get the facts out there.
One of the reports, or one of the things that Capistrano did in Southern California when they failed this parcel tax or this bond measure, is being able to provide facilities master plan data to the public to show the age of facilities. And so knowing certainly that you guys have all the data to show the age of these buildings, what projects need fixing, but then also being able to communicate directly with your citizens and get their feedback. And it sounds like you have support for this measure, but now keep engaging with them, keep building trust, and keep saying this is how we're doing this. Simi Valley School District in Southern California also uses OpenGov to actually track how this bond money is being spent. So when you have a bond oversight committee that tries to be accountable to how those funds are being spent, a lot of what either a CBO or somebody who's specifically in charge of looking at all this data, Simi Valley now, because we already have the data, the general ledger data of the district in the platform, we can isolate the codes that are driven by whatever measure to see exactly what projects, how they're being spent, and be able to slice and dice it, have all these visuals to really help the district tell their story. So without overwhelming you with all these different examples, really the case study here is how the district can best tell their story, communicate and get support from the community, and certainly with legal advice, doing it in a way that's informational and not saying we're advocating for this, but to the Prop 13 or whatever proposition it was, to say here's our list of projects. So I mean, we're certainly here to work with the school district to determine how to place this publicly to build engagement and trust. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So from what I understand from your presentation, what you're providing is use of the district's data so that the district can promote the need legally with information to the public. Is that correct?
It doesn't have to be used for promotional purposes. It's mainly a vehicle for you to put the facts out there.
Okay.
But you get to decide. I mean, it's a tool, so you get to decide how you use it.
So I see that this information and your services would be available both to the district but also to the campaign committee? Or is your stuff not directed to the campaign committee?
I think it would be available to the district.
Just one question, because I love me some data. Only because I found it fantastic. So you're aware of eddata.org?
Yes, sir.
Because I think minus them coming back with another update in the next 3 to 4 months to load up another much more FICMAT data, a lot of that's also available there as well, because I use it like a pastor preaches his Sunday sermon. I spend 8 or 10 hours a week on eddata drilling data, and that's all publicly available as well. And seems to be similar to what you're sort of proposing here, or at least presenting a version of that, if that makes sense. If you know the website, then you can sort of get to where I'm headed here.
Absolutely. So eddata is a really great resource, and I spent quite a bit of time with it. It's wonderful. Eddata, kind of the difference between what we have and what eddata has is eddata provides more like summary level information. What we do on the financial side is we get your full chart of accounts from the school's full chart of accounts, which is all the codes and descriptions for all their expenses and revenues and their balance sheet items. So we're able to drill down all the way into that detail. And like Paul mentioned, because of the way things are coded in the financial system, you're able to go all the way down and isolate things like Measure X, for instance, depending on the coding in your system. So it's going to give you more detail than what you're going to see in eddata, and it's also going to give you more control over what information you put in here. So you can put your financial information, which is based on your unique chart of accounts, all of that, revenues and expenses, balance sheet, etc. And you can also do performance information, non-financial information, more of the stuff you might see on eddata. All of that can go in here for display, or you can pull in the story section. If you like some things from eddata, you can cherry pick some items from eddata and pull those in as well.
So it seems like this would be like a secondary tool, in the sense that I start there and then want to dig deeper, because the financial stuff, you're right, you can get lost in a quick minute.
Yeah.
And that's even true on the eddata side with all the sort of selectable items that you can get to that they don't show.
Correct.
There's a myriad of lost mazes in there.
Yeah.
But aside from what we're talking about as the bond issue, I certainly like the concept of being able to take that information that I find extraordinarily valuable,
Yes.
and how I communicate that to people, whether it be fellow board members or staff or community members, and put it into a picture format that will keep me off of Excel for 8 or 10 hours.
Exactly. And kind of along the lines of the benefits of OpenGov, eddata is really great if you know what you're looking for or you know how to navigate the site. So OpenGov gives you the ability to cherry pick key pieces of data and then craft that meaningful narrative next to it so that anyone can understand, even if you're not into data.
And if I may, one thing I think about eddata is it's financial information of a point in the past. This is real time. From what I've seen when we started looking at the financial information, it's real time. They take our data today, and it's constantly being updated based on what we're doing now, not necessarily last year. And I think that's one difference. eddata is great. I agree. There's some really great information in there, but this allows us to take our data today and put it in a different format. That's one advantage I see.
Highlight to me of the evening, because I think it's critical to getting information out, irrespective to this specific issue, but trying to communicate the wealth and breadth of information that we're processing at a given moment in time and get it to something that's understandable in a chunk that can be eaten by somebody that doesn't know all the details is a huge hurdle in everything we do, I think. Because if you haven't done the homework, you're lost in a quick second. And the idea that this is current, but I'm a fan.
Hi.
I had a question. Who controls what's on the site? You or us?
You do. Sorry, you do. You provide us. Usually don't provide us with anything more that's already publicly available. Typically, the SACS data, which is a DAT file with all of the district's data, we basically have that in our platform, and so you provide that to us.
So with San San Mateo district that we saw there.
Yeah.
So they have their webpage,
Mhm.
you know, where there's phone numbers and email addresses and such for contacting staff, which that should remain on our own site.
Sure.
Is there a link to then this OpenGov site
There-
so that they can, if you want more information, click here and then you go straight to your site?
Yes, ma'am. Yep. Yep.
You can link it or you can embed in your website if you want to.
Okay. And then it's possible for us to have on our website, then if we had funds that we'd raised, separate funds, I would think, if we raised separate funds for the campaign, then it could be on a separate OpenGov, you know, Modesto City School bond campaign, and if you guys had, you know, help tell the story that way, if that was something, right?
I don't think so.
No? They're shaking their heads, no.
Because it's back to district resources.
No, I mean, if it was paid for separately,
Yeah, the committee couldn't, you know,
Across the firewall.
yeah, exactly.
okay.
We couldn't contract them and then the city contract them as well, right?
So I would advise you to think about this as a transparency tool for allowing your community to track if the bonds are successful, how you're spending those funds, and how you're implementing your projects. I don't think this is really useful from a campaign perspective. And timeline-wise, I struggle a little bit to think about how this can be used for the informational outreach between now and June 25th. So, but I think in terms of making complex data about bond expenditures available to the public in an easily digestible format in the future, I think that's what this offers.
Okay,
An
that's what I was
oversight
trying to
committee.
nail down. Where do we use this and when?
And I'm thinking oversight committee is to me, I'm looking at it going, this is what you would report to the oversight committee, and then that's how they could do the report out to the public, and you can ensure transparency in bond expenditures and making sure that it's compliant. I see that in that sense.
And I have one more question regarding the bond, the bond committee. How does the board vote in who is on that committee? How do they
No, that all
How
has
do
to
they-
happen separate. That's a group that forms independent of the school district, independent of the board. So we heard tonight, I mean, based on conversation, that there's at least one member of the board that wants to be part of that process. If others of you want to be involved in that process too, within the limits that Janet described, I would suggest we all coordinate with Trustee Brown to get a meeting scheduled, again, outside of district facilities where we can discuss the logistics of that. But really, by law, the district can't be involved in that process, including formal actions of the board.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for our OpenGov folks?
Take mine offline.
If I could take 30 seconds, the one thing I think is pretty powerful for the last part of our platform for actual community outreach is as I hover over some of these topics from Virginia Beach Public Schools, one of the things to call out is the fact that this has 2,400 visitors, 547 responses. It's 27 hours of public comment at 3 minutes apiece. So this is really powerful for people that cannot come to board meetings and cannot have their voice. And this isn't going to be specific to any sort of bond campaign. So this would be any topic that the school district feels is important to engage the public on.
I like that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Do you guys have any more questions for our OpenGov folks? Thank you very much.
Don't leave.
Don't leave. All right. And Mr. Zierli.
Yeah, I would just like to take a minute. We, and I apologize for not doing this at the beginning. You have a new person sitting up here, representing you and the district, and that is, if you haven't met her before, Janet Mueller. She's with DWK, and her expertise is in facilities. We utilize Janet a lot in her expertise for facilities questions and issues, and we are so fortunate that she agreed to take on a potential bond campaign and be our legal advisor for that. So this is who you're hearing from down here. I apologize for not saying that earlier.
Keep us on track.
Are there any additional issues or you want on that? All right, any additional comments from the board? Any additional comments from the public? I see smiles. All right, thank you. Then we will go ahead and I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
I move adjournment.
Second.
All right, the
Third.
motion has been made by Trustee Marks and seconded by Trustee Walker.
Okay.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.